All right, so we've been talking about this system as if evolution doesn't happen, and that, of course, is silly. Parasites are constantly evolving new strategies to parasitize another host, and host populations are constantly evolving defensive strategies. So we're going to talk about defense and offense here in this next little module.
All right, so remember back to that first video where I showed you the zombie parasite that was influencing the behavior of the ant. Yeah, I didn't explain much about that because I knew we were going to get to it here. So one cool thing that parasitic organisms do is they manipulate the behavior of their host so that they can maximize their likelihood of infecting new hosts. And so here's an example in the yellow dung fly. The yellow dung fly is a host, and it sometimes hosts to a fungus. This parasitic fungus, will infect yellow dung flies. And the yellow dung flies, instead of behaving like normal yellow dung flies that perch on grass, will go and find the tallest perch they can possibly find and perch up high. So you can see in this case, uninfected flies perch down low, infected flies perch up high, and then they have this behavior where they spread their wings and they expose their back end, their abdomen, to the wind. And the wind blows over and spores pour out of these spaces onto the uninfected flies that are perching at lower heights. So crazy! This sort of pattern is constant and regular in parasite dynamics. They often manipulate the host behavior to maximize infection. So here we can see some data to support this. So we see the uninfected dung fly and the infected dung fly, and what you can see is that uninfected dung flies on average perch at lower heights than infected dung flies. Moreover, uninfected dung flies tend to perch only on the top leaf surface. In contrast, uninfected dung flies hang off the bottom of the leaf surface in order to help with that dripping of those infected spores. So wild, right? Here's another example of parasite-induced changes in isopods or roly-polies. You know roly-polies. So isopod behavior. Here we have some examples. Okay. So on the left-hand side, we have parasitized isopods. And on the right-hand side, we have non-parasitized isopods. So non-parasitized isopods tend to hide when there is, under all circumstances, and especially so when there are fish around, right? So orange means there are no fish around, green means there's one fish in the vicinity, and blue means two fish in the vicinity. So non-parasitized isopods tend to hide generally, but they hide more when there are more fish around, right? In contrast, parasitized isopods don't hide. They avoid hiding. Only 20% of parasitized isopods or less were hiding, and they did so regardless of how many fish were there. They wanted to get eaten. Why? Because the fish are the intermediate, or are the hosts that will be the next host for the parasite in the isopods. So the parasite in the isopods needs to be transferred between isopod to fish, and they facilitate that behavior. It's wild to see. Now, as I mentioned, hosts are not helpless. They have lots of opportunities to do things in order to avoid being parasitized. And biologists studying primates quickly realized that the food choices that primates were making were non-random. And some of the foods that they chose were things that weren't really good at providing them with a whole pile of energy, but actually were really good at killing parasites, endoparasites. So chimpanzees will go and select food when they have too many internal parasites that will kill the parasites within them. This is very common for lots of organisms. It's interesting. Here's another example of a significant issue in parasitism. So rabbits. Rabbits were introduced to Australia. I mentioned this last week. Rabbits were introduced to Australia, and they had devastating effects on the landscape. I think I also showed you at one point a picture of a cactus population that had been decimated by rabbits, right? So rabbits will eat anything they can get their hands on if they're hungry enough, and they did so in Australia after being introduced. So what people started to do was to fence areas off to protect it from rabbits. And eventually, these rabbits were contained in a relatively small area. And then what researchers realized was that there is a deadly parasite of rabbits, myxomatosis, and if you release myxomatosis in one rabbit, it will infect the rest of the population. So there was a huge program of trying to control rabbits in Australia by releasing myxomatosis, this parasite that kills rabbits. And so what's interesting is then when you release myxoma, sorry, I was giving you the wrong name, myxoma in the previous slide. When you release it into a population of rabbits that have never experienced myxoma before, almost all of them die, like a significant number die. But you'll notice it's not 100%. And those individuals that did survive the experience will reproduce and survive, and then the next time they are exposed to myxoma, their tendency to die is less. And so what Australia is struggling with now is that there are still some rabbits in Australia, but these rabbit populations have evolved to reduce their mortality in response to myxoma such that they are no longer vulnerable to this disease. It's only 20% or maybe 25% of the population is dying after their population has been exposed to myxoma epidemics. It's so interesting. There can be evolution. That's not to say that evolution happens without a significant amount of death and suffering, but host populations will evolve, as will parasite populations. Now, another major parasite, and this is an ectoparasite here in Ontario and all through North America, is the black-legged tick. And the black-legged tick carries a very well-known endoparasite called Lyme disease. So here's the life cycle of Lyme disease, and you can see that ticks will survive winters as long as the winters aren't too cold. If the winters are really cold, then they will die, and that's why we haven't had them traditionally up north. But as global climate change occurs, we are seeing more and more tick populations survive the winter. But ticks survive the winter, and female ticks will lay eggs in the spring. Those eggs hatch into tick larvae, and the larval ticks attach to a rodent. Now, when they attach to a rodent that is already infected with Lyme disease, and it's Borrelia burgdorferi, the ticks will feed on the rodent's blood, and the parasite, the bacterial parasite, is transferred through rodent's blood into the tick. Now, the ticks feed and they get full and they fall off through that summer, and then they'll live in the leaf litter. They'll go through their life stages, so they'll molt several times into tick nymphs in the fall, and then the infected nymphs overwinter under the leaves. In the spring, those infected ticks attach to a variety of animals in the spring, and they feed on the host blood, and then they fall off. So they'll attach to a starling or any bird. They'll attach to your dog. They will attach to you. They feed on your blood, and then they fall off. But in feeding on your blood, they actually spit a little bit into your body, and that is when the transfer of Lyme disease might occur. And then once they fall off, they live in the leaf litter, they molt into adult ticks, and those adult ticks attach to a deer in the fall, and they feed on its blood, and they mate with other ticks, and then they fall off. That is the cycle, but ultimately it's one that's pretty problematic, in part because we're having a really hard time controlling tick migration as they move north, as our winters become calmer. The other thing that we've seen that drives tick abundance and therefore Lyme disease abundance is the amount of acorns produced in a given year. So oak trees produce acorns, but they do so not continuously every year. When you start watching oak trees, and you might have an oak tree near your house, so go and watch it this fall, you will see some years it produces volumes of acorns, and then other years not so much. This process of fluctuation in seed production, in acorn production, is so that when squirrels and mice harvest those acorns, if they overwhelm those populations with such a large number of acorns, then squirrels and mice won't be able to eat them all. They'll store them in their hiding places, in their little dens, but they won't necessarily eat them all. And that means that oak trees can survive and grow as seedlings. But when there are lots of acorns, that means that there are lots of rodents, and those lots of rodents end up providing the initial habitat for those tick larvae that then starts that really big boom of Lyme disease that we saw earlier in the module. So that's explaining sort of how dynamics between disease and parasites, as well as their hosts, work together. I hope you've enjoyed this module, and that's it.